Warning: this video contains spoilers for the original Final Fantasy VII, as well as Final Fantasy VII Remake. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello there. Thanks for the click. In this video, I'd like to take a look at a character from Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake, Barret Wallace. Specifically, I'd like to talk about how this character was changed in FF7 Remake compared to the original. Because the more I've thought about it, it seems to me that the Barret from 1997 and Barret from 2020 are actually, well, not quite the same character.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
I know. Some of you may hear that and think this guy has no idea what he's talking about. After all, in both stories, Barret is the leader of Avalanche who fights to protect the planet from the Shinra Corporation. In both stories, he's portrayed as a loving father to his daughter Marlene. In both stories, he's a short-tempered but passionate leader who clashes with Cloud's indifference towards his cause. And in both stories, he eventually opens up to a new perspective and learns that things are not as simple as he once thought. And these observations are all true. So then how can I make the claim that Barret in FF7 and Barret in the remake are not the same Barret? Well, to do that, I'll have to do something that's perhaps not the best idea, which is attempt to present a nuanced argument on the internet. Now, before I get into it, one quick disclaimer. This video is not intended to validate any opinions or debates about FF7 original versus the remake. I will give my perspective near the end, but overall this video is intended to promote discussion about the character. So with that said, the title of this video is How FF7 Remake Changed Barret Thematically. And that last word is where the key change to the character was made. But what exactly do I mean by thematically? Well, fundamentally, nearly every story, whether it's from a video game, novel, TV show, film, and so on, can usually be broken down into four main elements: setting, plot, characters, and theme. The first three elements are fairly straightforward and easy to understand. The setting is the location and time period of where and when the story takes place. The plot is the structure of the story, the sequence of events that build on one another from beginning to end. And characters are typically most people's favorite element because, well, good characters anchor the audience into the story by giving us a reason to care. Characters often go on a journey of personal growth or make some kind of significant change or contribution to their society, or simply have an impact on those close to them, and so on. There are many different purposes a character can fulfill depending on the goals of the writer. Now, where things get a little hazy is around this fourth element, the theme. A story's theme is often summarized as the moral of the story. It's the core idea, lesson, or argument that the storyteller is presenting to the audience through the setting, plot, and characters. A message or concept that may not only apply to the characters in the story, but possibly our own lives in the real world as well. Analyzing themes can be tricky, because some stories might focus on one clear, central theme, and some themes may be presented as a philosophical question with no obvious answer, where the intended goal is for the audience to question its meaning afterwards and come to their own conclusions. So with that in mind, let's bring things back to Barret. What kind of theme is being presented to us with this character? Well, from my reading of the original story, the story of Barret is a cautionary tale about a vengeful man who chose to put his own feelings above the well-being of others. A tragedy about the consequences of extreme selfishness. But to make sure we're all on the same page, I'll recap the important moments from Barret's original story before we compare and contrast his character arc in the remake. From the moment we start a new game in Final Fantasy VII, Barret is introduced to us as a strong-willed and passionate idealist who often comes off as belligerent and threatening towards those who he doesn't trust. The man's priorities seem confused at times, as he's a single father who cares deeply for his only child, but that responsibility often takes a back seat to his role as the leader of an eco-terrorist gang called Avalanche. Now, while they are a terrorist group, Avalanche actually has a worthy cause: to fight back against the greedy megacorporation, Shinra. Shinra has grown to become both the world's strongest economic and military power due to its monopoly of Mako energy, which is the most effective fuel source for powering technology in FF7's world. But the process of extracting Mako energy from the Earth is also depleting the life stream, the collective spiritual energy of the planet, which is essential to the cycle of life and death of all living things. Clearly something very important to the environment which shouldn't be so recklessly exploited for profit. And because of this dire threat to the planet's health, Barret feels he has the moral high ground to lead Avalanche to take drastic actions against Shinra. But the group's chosen method of fighting back, the bombing of Shinra's Mako reactors, is where things start to get ugly. Many innocent civilians are wounded or killed due to the enormous explosion that destroys the reactor. Now, you might think that this would be cause for concern for Avalanche, but actually, the massive amount of collateral damage doesn't seem to faze Barret or his team very much at all. There's no debate or discussion within the group regarding if destruction on this scale was necessary or justified. Instead, Barret boasts to his comrades that the next explosion will be even bigger. And an optional dialogue with Jessie reveals how surprised, yet proud she is that her very first attempt at creating a bomb could cause such a massive blast. These sentiments are similar in the original Japanese text as well, where Barret says something along the lines of the next bomb being more flashy, and Jessie tells Cloud that her bomb is shining brightly, which makes her feel happy. So it's made clear that the group is just so focused on their end goal of stopping Shinra that they spare no thought for the innocent people caught up in the crossfire, and so they decide to carry on with their next bombing mission the very next day. But after Avalanche's second successful reactor bombing, Shinra decides to strike back with drastic actions of their own. President Shinra gives the order to drop an entire section of Midgar's upper city onto the slums below, just to take out Avalanche's tiny headquarters in Sector 7. A shocking and unnecessary act that demolishes entire neighborhoods of both the upper and lower city. The collapsing plate kills countless more civilians, including all three of Barret's Avalanche companions, who fought desperately as they tried to prevent the catastrophe. Their deaths enrage Barret and strengthen his conviction to stop Shinra, no matter the cost. As the story continues, the group eventually leaves Midgar, and we begin to learn more about Barret's history and motivations. During a visit to the outskirts of North Corel, Barret reveals that Shinra destroyed his hometown 5 years ago, because someone from the village, allegedly, sabotaged their newly constructed Mako reactor in the area. But before the massacre, we learn that Barret and most of the other villagers were actually in favor of building the Mako reactor. They weren't aware of the harm that Mako energy caused at that time, so most of them supported Shinra's plan to build the reactor as a way to revive the town's struggling economy. Barret's best friend Dine is the only one who's shown to be against the plan. But after the alleged sabotage of the reactor, nearly everyone from the village was killed by Shinra. Dine is one of those killed in the aftermath, but Barret managed to rescue his best friend's daughter Marlene, who he adopted as his own child. But when Barret returns to the ruins of Old Corel for the first time in 5 years, he learns that Dine somehow survived the attack. But he's no longer the friend he once knew. Dine has since become a broken man, unable to overcome the tragedy of his past. Barret confronts Dine and tells him that Marlene is still alive, that there's still a chance for him to return to her and put his life back together. But sadly, Barret's plea falls on deaf ears. Dine is unable to overcome his feelings of self-loathing and regret, and takes his own life in front of Barret. This scenario sheds light on what actually set Barret down his path against Shinra. That his campaign against the corporation began as a quest for revenge for his friends and family, rather than the altruistic goal of saving the planet from the harm caused by Mako. And even his seemingly selfless act of taking in Marlene could be seen as a way of him holding on to his past, a daily reminder of Corel and the life that Shinra took from him. The reveal of this backstory calls into question if Barret is really in this fight for the planet's sake, or if that's just a worthy excuse for him to act out his revenge through extreme measures. Now let's fast forward the story to near the end of Disc 1. During the group's journey to the northern crater, Barret has an epiphany regarding humanity's relationship with nature. Traveling through the harsh tundra landscape causes him to realize that mankind's survival will always require some amount of struggle against our environment. And therefore, we will always be reliant on tools and technology to some degree in order to overcome those challenges. Which leads him to the thought that perhaps even Shinra don't seem so bad when thinking about it from that point of view. But Barret quickly backtracks on this statement and reverts back to his familiar anti-Shinra stance. However, this brief scene is important as it shows Barret starting to consider a more nuanced perspective for the first time. A small glimpse of him stepping outside of his narrow, "you're either with me or against me" mentality that he's shown up to this point. Fast forwarding again, we now come to a pivotal scene in Barret's arc just before the party returns to Midgar, near the end of Disc 2. Here, Barret is confronted by Reeve, a Shinra executive who had long been spying on the group in secret. Reeve takes the opportunity to chastise Barret over the innocent people who were killed by Avalanche's reactor bombings earlier in the story. But Barret deflects the accusation and tries to pin the blame back on Shinra as the ones who are truly in the wrong. But as the tensions rise, Tifa interjects and says, "What we did in Midgar can't be forgotten, no matter what the reason." Barret turns away from the group and falls silent, leaving us to wonder if he's just stewing in his anger, or if he will consider Tifa's words and reflect on his past actions. And finally, in a scene just before the party sets off for the final battle, Barret is still fully dedicated to the cause of saving the planet, but he admits to everyone that his past actions and motivations were wrong. It sounds cool saying it's to save the planet, but I was the one who blew up that Mako reactor. Looking back on it now, I can see that wasn't the right way to do things. I made a lot of friends and innocent bystanders suffer. At first, it was revenge against Shinra for attacking my town. But now, I'm fighting for Marlene. I want to save the planet for Marlene's sake. So what was the overall theme conveyed by this character back in 1997? Well, if we take a step back and examine the events of Barret's entire story, Shinra destroyed his hometown because someone from the village, allegedly, sabotaged the nearby Mako reactor. And then about 5 years later, Barret leads a gang of terrorists to sabotage and destroy Shinra's Mako reactors, this time in the most densely populated city in the world. And how did Shinra respond to the attack on Midgar's reactors? Well, almost exactly the same as 5 years prior. Barret had already experienced firsthand how violent and vindictive Shinra truly was, that they were willing to kill innocent people in retaliation against anyone who opposed their monopoly on Mako energy, even civilians who were generally in favor of Shinra and positive towards Mako. Barret should have known this better than anyone, yet he still chose to take an even more destructive action against Shinra compared to the event the company used as an excuse to murder his family and friends. The destruction and suffering in Midgar caused by the Avalanche-Shinra conflict was on a scale much greater than what happened in Corel, something that Barret should have foreseen based on his experience. But instead, He chose to act on his own feelings before considering the safety of innocent people. He was blinded by a selfish desire for revenge, and the result was him provoking a deadly beast to kill yet again, despite already knowing that it was willing to do so in the past. Most of us will hopefully never find ourselves in such extreme situations where our actions could lead to such catastrophe, but the core theme presented through Barret's character is simple, yet important. Don't be selfish. Always think of how your actions might affect others first before you do what you feel is justified for yourself. When boiled down to the core idea, it's a relevant and applicable moral lesson that everyone can learn to apply in their own life on a daily basis, even in mundane or seemingly insignificant situations. And that underlying theme about the danger of selfishness is a large part of what makes Barret an effective and memorable character all these years later. So keeping all of that in mind, how did Barret's character arc change in FF7 Remake? Well, many of the critics of Remake story will point out right away to the changes made in this key scene near the end of Chapter 1. In the Remake's version of events, it becomes very clear that Avalanche's bomb was only intended to damage and disable the reactor, not destroy it completely. Instead, it turns out to be President Shinra who gives the command to destroy his own reactor. His reason for doing so, and then doing so again with Mako Reactor 5, is later revealed as a scheme to frame Avalanche as an extremely dangerous terrorist organization that is conspiring with Wutai, an enemy nation that Shinra defeated in the last war.
Such methods are beneath me. As are you, my faithful stewardess. Henceforth allies of wicked Wutai, our sworn enemy. Thank you for stoking our people's patriotic fervor.
Wutai! The hell we are!
This means that President Shinra decided to destroy his own reactor as a sort of false flag operation that would allow him to control Midgar citizens through fear. But why would Shinra be willing to go to such extreme lengths to do this? Well, it's revealed later that the president has no intention of fixing the destroyed reactors, and that the company is searching for what's known as the Promised Land, a legendary place believed to hold enormous amounts of Mako energy. Once they find it, Shinra will construct a new and improved Neo Midgar over the Promised Land, which will be even larger and more profitable. The president is confident that they will find the Promised Land soon, which in his view makes the current version of Midgar an expiring asset, so there's no reason for him to rebuild or sink any more money into the city. Better to use it in a way that will further his agenda before he abandons it for Neo Midgar. This Promised Land and Neo Midgar scheme is Shinra's goal in the original story as well. But the remake takes it a step further by adding elements of pro-war propaganda to expand on Shinra's two-faced corporate deception. It's also worth noting that Wutai and the larger Avalanche organization are portrayed as a much more well-organized and competent threat to Shinra in this version of the story, and so it may not be completely unreasonable for the citizens of Midgar to fall for Shinra's lies. By using Avalanche as a pawn in his political chess game, the president plants seeds of doubt and fear into Midgar citizens, causing them to rely on Shinra even more for protection until Neo Midgar would be completed. So this action does make sense from the Heartless CEO's perspective. But how do Avalanche and Barret react to this? Well, it becomes clear early on that in this version of the story, Barret and the other members of Avalanche did not intend such catastrophic damage, and actually regret the level of harm they believe was caused by their bomb.
No way.
This couldn't have been us, could it?
But what if it was?
What's done is done.
You're, holding up pretty well, huh? Even after what we saw at the station and all over Sector 8?
I'm a soldier.
Wow. My hands are still shaking.
You get used to it.
Something to look forward to. Or maybe not.
Little help, Cloud? Please? Don't be stupid. I can't stop thinking about it. The bomb I made shouldn't have produced an explosion that big. It doesn't make any sense.
The explosion triggered a reaction with the Mako. You said so yourself.
That was my first guess, but shouldn't the reactor have fail-safes to prevent that kind of thing? No. I'm just looking for excuses for something that was clearly my own fault. Gotta own up to it if I'm gonna learn from this and move on. Thanks, Cloud. You're a good listener.
This is a reframing of the character's morality compared to the original story, where they showed no remorse for the collateral damage they caused or the innocents who they killed. When we look at Barret's reaction to the event, his resolve to fight Shinra is still unwavering, but in this version, he doesn't brag to his companions about how the next explosion will be even bigger.
Now get some R&R. You've earned it. Just be ready for the next mission, alright?
Instead, there's an extra mission added for Remake story where Avalanche acquires a new blasting agent in an effort to make sure their next bomb is less destructive. The opposite goal of what Barret declared in the original. Furthermore, about 2 years after the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Square Enix released a series of articles on its website titled Final Fantasy VII Remake Revisited, in which the developers gave insight about their thoughts when creating the game. In the article discussing Chapter 1, co-director Motomu Toriyama was quoted as saying, "It's not just Jesse. The other members of Avalanche also have a somewhat casual, student protest kind of approach to taking down Shinra and protecting the planet. Jesse and the team did not imagine they would cause such extensive damage with their first bombing mission at Reactor 1, so they fell right into Shinra's trap. Later on, they are tricked into inflicting major casualties on Sector 8 and the surrounding area. From then onwards, Avalanche generally takes on a more serious mood." Toriyama's description here of a casual student protest approach is quite a departure from how Avalanche was portrayed in the original story. It's possible that this change in character may have been mandated by Square Enix corporate in order to soften the terrorism elements that were present in the original story, while still trying to stay mostly faithful to the original Midgar plot. That's just some speculation on my part, but whatever the reason for the change was, the critics of Remake certainly have a valid point when they say that Avalanche's intentions and attitude have been altered, and that these changes affect Barret's original character arc. However, if we take these changes into account within the full context of the Remake story, we actually see that Barret's entire character arc is fundamentally different, and not necessarily just a less effective version of what it was before. As we established in the first part of this video, in the original Final Fantasy VII, Barret is portrayed as a short-sighted man who's hell-bent on personal revenge, regardless of the pain that his actions may cause to others. And the primary theme of this character arc is the cost of extreme selfishness. However, in Final Fantasy VII Remake, the character has been rewritten to show us a version of Barret whose actions are still motivated by revenge, but his core character flaw has been adjusted from selfishness to self-centered and naive advocacy. A somewhat subtle shift from a narrow-minded and violent terrorist to a still violent and foolish, political activist. Just like before, Barret has a very strong conviction in his beliefs, but Remake shows us a version of the character that routinely fails to read the room or understand how his words and actions actually push people further away from his cause. The primary lesson or theme of his character in this version has shifted to effective advocacy requires empathy. But what does that mean exactly? Well, to be an advocate for something is to discuss or argue for a cause or idea that you believe in. Many of us do this on a daily basis with friends and family when discussing things like entertainment, politics, religion, pizza toppings, and other important but divisive issues. Before the internet, these discussions would primarily happen locally, at home, the restaurant, the office, the classroom, and so on. But with the rise of social media, we now have the ability to argue with people who don't agree with us practically anytime and anywhere. So now many more people are willing to become outspoken online advocates for the ideas that they believe in. But in many of those cases, people are certainly very passionate advocates, but absolutely not effective advocates for their cause. This isn't necessarily because they have a lack of knowledge of the issue. That's not usually the big problem. The reason their advocacy is often counterproductive is because they show very little understanding or empathy towards the feelings and perspectives of those who aren't already aligned with their views. They don't give enough consideration to how their choice of words or actions make them appear to those who are opposed, undecided, or even just uninterested. You know, the very people whose opinions would actually need to be changed in order for overall public sentiment to reach a new consensus and for the goals of the advocate to eventually become realized. Now, social media doesn't exist in the world of FF7 Remake, but the new portrayal of Barret is essentially this type of self-centered internet advocate dialed up to 11. We see this very early on during the elevator scene between Cloud, Barret, and Jesse. At this point, Cloud couldn't care less about the cause of saving the planet and is shown to be completely apathetic to Barret's anti-Mako energy speech.
It doesn't rest, and it doesn't care! You do realize what Mako is, don't you?
And yet, despite Cloud's clear disinterest, Barret pushes harder and harder to win him over, as if just his sheer passion for the subject will somehow move Cloud over to his side.
Answer me! You gonna stand there and pretend you can't hear the planet crying out in pain? I know you can!
Even Jessie, who's fully aligned with Barret's goals, is embarrassed by his display. Her body language hints that this is something that Barret does regularly, a behavior that the other members of Avalanche have just learned to deal with. But when Barret doesn't receive the affirmation from Cloud that he's looking for, he's easily baited into a confrontation.
You really hear that?
Damn straight I do!
Get help.
Say that again!
Now, a version of this scene exists in the original game as well, and it follows almost all of the same beats, but the key difference was that it was shorter and to the point. The arrogant and cocky Cloud is still shown to be disinterested in Avalanche's larger goal, but Barret doesn't push back nearly as hard to try and win him over to his side. Instead, Barret simply turns his back and shakes his fist, which at the time was an effective way for the simple 3D model to convey his frustration. In the original scene, Barret makes his case for the planet, becomes frustrated with Cloud's attitude, and then continues on with the mission. Their intense stare-down didn't actually happen until later when they argued back at Avalanche HQ after the mission. And in that situation, it was actually Cloud who was baited in by Barret, not the reverse like we see here in Remake. So the elevator scene originally served as some brief exposition for the player to learn about Avalanche's goal, but in FF7 Remake, the focus of the scene is almost entirely on Barret's passionate display and how the other characters react to him. Here, Barret acts as if he's the featured speaker of an anti-Shinra rally, despite having an audience of just 2 people. Now, if this was the only difference between the original portrayal of Barret and the remake version, we could still make the case that Barret's characterization is effectively the same, just exaggerated for the sake of increasing the drama between him and Cloud early on. But as the story continues, the differences start to add up. The next noteworthy scene to look at is immediately after the bombing mission when Avalanche steps out into a ruined Sector 8. This time, Barret gives another passionate speech, ironically with the Shinra theme playing in the background. But now, his supporters outnumber Cloud 3-1, which gives him the opportunity to just repeat his core beliefs to his loyal followers.
Y'all gotta look at the bigger picture here. Nothing worth fighting for was ever won without sacrifice. Though you may not be crying out, I know you're in pain, just like the planet. But it's okay, cause I'm here for you, to help take the load off your shoulders.
An effective leadership tactic to strengthen their resolve in the wake of the unexpected outcome, but it's also an opportunity to receive the positive feedback that Cloud denied him earlier. In the original version, no remorse or regret is shown by any of the Avalanche members during this scene, and so no anti-Shinra or pro-planet rhetoric is necessary from Barret here. He just reminds them to rendezvous back at the train station. A quick mission update to keep everyone on the same page, brief and to the point, with some additional characterization sprinkled in near the end. Now, let's review a third scene from Remake's story. Here, Barret encounters 3 Shinra employees on the train back to Sector 7, with none of his comrades nearby other than Cloud observing quietly in the background. Barret decides to interrupt the Shinra employees' conversation when he overhears them condemning Avalanche.
Hey, quit talking out your ass. Everyone knows Avalanche only cares about saving the planet.
Unfortunately, Barret's approach in this situation is essentially the same as the 2 prior scenes. He has no convincing talking points for anyone who doesn't see things the same way he does, so he uses the same style rhetoric that he would for someone who already shares his views.
In my humble opinion, that explosion was a message. A message to the bastards bleeding our planet dry. Think they got it? Heard it loud and clear? Y'all's masters?
Because of his tendency to confidently jump up on his soapbox, we can tell that FF7 Remake's version of Barret has clearly spent a lot of time thinking about his feelings and beliefs, but almost no time at all regarding how his message would actually be received by an audience. So when his opponents push back with their cartoonishly narrow-minded Shinra propaganda,
That is the Shinra Creed.
Barret doesn't have any counterpoint. He hasn't thought of an effective messaging strategy other than what already appeals to himself, and so his knee-jerk reaction is to insult their perspective and resort to intimidation. And then, just like with the elevator scene, he ends up pushing his audience further away from his point of view. In this case, literally scaring them away.
You hear that suit? Shinra Creed my ass.
Now, while this was a new scene added for Remake, there is a somewhat similar event in the original story where Barret confronts a Shinra employee on the train during the second bombing mission. In that scene, Barret confronts the man over a petty insult. The man then foolishly reveals that he works for Shinra, which causes Barret to impulsively draw his gun and threaten him before Tifa steps in to de-escalate the situation. The key difference here is that there is no desire by Barret to preach the virtues of Avalanche or debate the issue of Mako Energy's effect on the planet. It's a scene mostly played for laughs at the expense of the terrified Shinra manager, and to reinforce Barret's quick temper. This confrontation with the Shinra manager happens in Remake also, but notice how it's been rewritten as another debate over the issue of Avalanche and Mako Energy.
Avalanche is a blight on Midgar.
Huh?
Their bomb threat has thrown our offices into chaos, let alone the reactor itself. It's total insanity! But we won't lose heart. No! Everyone at Shinra agrees. The reactor will stay online.
Is that right?
What? You got a problem with that?
But this time, Barret gets cut off before he can even get started. Both train scenes show us Barret's hardline anti-Shinra stance and his general foolishness for getting heated in the moment, as in both cases he should be trying to keep a low profile. But the scenes play out differently because Barret's main character flaw in FF7 Remake has been altered. The remake version once again presents Barret as a naive and ineffective advocate, contrasted with the original Barret, who simply never bothered to debate Mako Energy, Avalanche, or Shinra with anyone other than Cloud, which was only due to Tifa's insistence for Cloud to join their cause. Barret's selfishness is still his core flaw, but now it's been shifted to a more specific issue of a self-centered mindset and lack of empathy that leads to poor messaging. Okay, so now let's look at another short scene during the second bombing mission. This is another new scene that was added for Remake.
Okay, listen up, y'all. Everything Shinra has told you is a goddamn lie. Mako is the lifeblood of our planet. Those greedy bastards are bleeding it dry. Y'all gotta rise up.
Barret, who are you talking to?
The people put me on TV. I'm gonna drop some truth.
Thousand Gil says they cut the sound.
It's a simple, comedic scene, but it further reinforces Barret's naivety as he assumes that he can use Shinra's own broadcast to bring Midgar civilians over to his side, even though it's already been made clear by Shinra's henchman Heidegger that Shinra holds all the cards in this situation. They're the ones controlling the cameras and selectively editing all the footage, which means they get to contextualize all of Avalanche's motives and actions in the eyes of the public. But even aside from that, Barret's rhetoric here once again reveals how he's still leading with his own feelings instead of an effective message for those not already in his camp. What he's saying about Shinra is actually true, but he won't convince a mostly pro-Shinra audience that Avalanche is in the right by labeling his opposition as greedy bastards. Because while Shinra is in fact exploiting the planet for profit, that exploitation has also led to prosperity for many of Midgar's citizens. And when people are comfortable, they're generally resistant to the idea that their leaders could be misguided or corrupt. So even with the facts on his side, Barret fails to make his case in a way that his audience would actually be receptive to. At the end of this chapter, the party is confronted by President Shinra via hologram, who reveals that Avalanche has played right into his hands and allowed him to spin a narrative of fear over Midgar. He also asserts that the people of Midgar are fully aware of the environmental damage caused by Mako Energy, but they willingly ignore that fact due to the quality of life that Mako Energy grants them.
I wonder. The true nature of Mako is known to one and all, yet the people willfully turn a blind eye to the costs. As you must surely be aware.
An implication that Barret rejects as he lashes out in anger once again. The original version of this scene with the president doesn't include any mention of how Midgar civilians feel about Mako Energy. Instead, Shinra confronts the group to confidently gloat over Avalanche and foreshadows Sephiroth, something that Remake already did much earlier at this point. The Remake version of the scene follows most of the same details of the original plot, but now serves a different purpose. The story then shifts away from Avalanche and Barret for the next several chapters until the party is reunited during the Sector 7 platefall sequence. In perhaps what is the best acted scene of the entire game, Tifa suggests that Avalanche actually shares responsibility for provoking Shinra's horrific action. But Barret can't let that idea take root, so he quickly tries to convince Tifa to shift the blame entirely back on Shinra.
It was us. We did this.
No. You can't think like that. Whatever came before it was Shinra that pulled the trigger today. Am I right?
Yeah.
Hold on to this anger, okay?
The morning after the tragedy of Sector 7, There is a short scene where the group is confronted by Shinra propaganda once again. Barret's first instinct is to do what he always does in these situations, simply shout down the opposition. But this time, Tifa steps in and urges him to consider the concerns of other people first.
We ain't no damn pawns of Wutai. I couldn't care less about the rest, but that shit...
No one will listen to us. There's no point in even trying. I'm sorry.
Hey, Tifa, listen. There's no room in this for regrets or what-ifs or any of that. All we can do is keep moving forward, keep following this path we chose. Wherever, so we can say we did all we could.
I know. But right now, instead of looking forward, you need to look around. Everyone here is terrified. So I'm asking you, don't.
Much like the original FF7, it's Tifa who interjects and serves as the catalyst for Barret to change his self-centered perspective. But in Remake, it comes much earlier in the story and isn't quite the same lesson to be learned. Later on, when the party infiltrates the top floors of the Shinra headquarters, they walk through a series of exhibits dedicated to the history of Shinra and the so-called miracle of Mako energy.
Welcome to the Shinra building, our humble home.
Oh, hell no!
Here, in the Memorial Museum, you can learn all about our president, as well as the various divisions that make up the company. And of course, the city of Midgar, and the miracle of Mako energy. Whatever takes your fancy, you're sure to learn something new.
Once again, the party is confronted by Shinra propaganda, but now they see it in the same way as an average citizen of Upper Midgar, as a friendly and refined presentation offering a message of progress, convenience, and safety. By the end of the tour, it's clear why Shinra has most of the public aligned with them and against Avalanche. It's because they simply know their audience much better. They can get away with lies about the supposedly limitless resource of Mako energy because their lies are more pleasant and convincing than Avalanche's truth. Because people as individuals typically want to just do what's right and be left alone to live a comfortable life. But people as a collective will often follow along with whoever has a better narrative or offers them some kind of material benefit. And Shinra provides them with both. And Barret seems to finally understand this by the end of the Midgar presentation when he says,
"Nothing but a bunch of lies."
Except that Mako has made people's lives better.
It's made people blind. Blind to the cold, hard truth. Even I used to buy into their bullshit. Remembering that makes me even madder.
As he looks down at his gun arm, foreshadowing the events of his past in a future remake title, but also showing us that he's finally starting to empathize with those who live happily under Shinra's thumb, just as he did 5 years earlier. And finally, Barret's new character arc concludes during his confrontation with the president at the top of the Shinra building. The party finds the president in a helpless position, pathetically begging his enemies to save his life. It's a much different situation compared to the original story, where the party finds the president's body slumped over in his office chair, already killed by Sephiroth before they even arrived. So it's easy to get bogged down in the details of just how different this scene plays out compared to the original. But if we consider all of Barret's remake scenes that led up to this moment, it becomes clear that the scenario writers put the president in this situation in order to show Barret's character growth, to resolve the new character flaw that he was given in this version of the story. Because when Barret finally has the upper hand on his enemy for the first time, what does he do? He hesitates for a moment, but then actually steps in to save the president's life. He saves the man responsible for the death of his family and friends. He doesn't do this because he's forgiven his enemy, but because he now understands what it will take to turn the narrative in his favor, and he believes he can force the president's cooperation in order to accomplish that.
You're gonna get on TV and tell them what you did to Sector 7, that it was you who killed all those people. Then, you're gonna tell them the truth about Avalanche. That Avalanche ain't Wu-Tai or anybody's puppet. That Avalanche fights for the people, the planet. That we fight to hold Shinra to account for its crimes. That is Avalanche.
Barret shows in the scene that he's finally realized what it takes to be an effective advocate. You have to tell people a better story. One that's not just true, but also speaks to them from their own perspective. You have to have empathy for your target audience and present your facts in a way that is persuasive to them, not you. And so Barret is finally ready to take the first step towards creating an effective message, even if it requires him to set aside his personal desire for revenge. However, the President turns this around and accuses Barret of only being interested in clearing his name, that deep down Barret is still just a selfish man who doesn't really care about the planet.
That is what matters most to you? More than shutting down the reactors? Than the future of the planet itself?
Huh? Damn.
You're lying to yourself even now.
But Shinra's words here ring a bit hollow because we already saw from Barret's actions that this just isn't true. Because if he was only thinking and acting on his own desires, he would have no problem letting the President fall to his death. Shinra then claims that even if harvesting Mako energy was banned, the people aren't ready to go back to the way things were before. They're too accustomed to the standard of living they now have due to Mako.
Picture a world without Shinra, without Mako energy. A stagnant, impotent world. Now picture a natural disaster. Who would help the people? Help them recover and rebuild? You.
And Barret isn't prepared to respond to any of this, because he's only just begun to look at things from outside his perspective. He hasn't spent enough time considering viable alternatives to Mako energy that people would be willing to accept. To do that will require even more empathy and understanding on his part. He'll need to actually go out and meet with the people who rely on Mako energy the most, many of whom probably work for Shinra and have no moral objections about using Mako. But then, the President is suddenly killed by Sephiroth anyway, robbing Barret of the opportunity to shift the narrative in his favor. The Barret of the original FF7 wouldn't even care about this. He would have killed the President himself without thinking twice. In fact, we see him prepare to take his shot without hesitation, before realizing that Sephiroth had already done the deed for him. Barret even assumes that Sephiroth might be a good guy for helping them kill Shinra before Cloud quickly corrects him. In contrast, Barret in FF7 Remake actually rebukes Sephiroth for killing the President, because he knows that he needed his nemesis alive in order to help him win over the public. So, wrapping things up now, it's clear to me that we've been presented with two different versions of Barret. Characters with similar characterization and temperament, but just different enough to communicate different themes to the audience. We can debate which story managed to convey the character's theme more effectively, but first we have to acknowledge that we're actually looking at two versions of the character that serve two different thematic purposes. I also want to note that the changes made to Barret in the remake are not a result of the Whispers of Fate, Sephiroth's expanded presence in Midgar, or the overarching mystery of the remake trilogy. None of those things affect the key scenes of Barret's remake arc, which means these changes to Barret were a deliberate choice made by the writers. They could have left Barret's core character flaw exactly the same as it was before, but they chose to rewrite the character in a way that allowed them to deliver a more specific theme instead. Personally, I think that the original theme of Barret's character arc is more tragic and more applicable to a wider audience. It had a darker tone due to the fact that Avalanche's 2 bombing missions directly caused civilian casualties, making the end of his arc a bitter pill to swallow for the audience, since it's fundamentally about a terrorist who learned a hard lesson, but mostly at the expense of his victims. But even his role of saving the world in the end won't bring those innocent people back. He can never really undo what he did, only try to be a better person going forward and ask for forgiveness that many would say he doesn't really deserve. The remake version of Avalanche still committed acts of violence and economic terrorism, but it's made very clear to the audience that Avalanche is not responsible for any civilian casualties, and that the group actually feels regret when it appears that they are responsible for far more damage than they intended. The writers then used these changes to take Barret in a different direction, one that allowed them to give him a self-contained character arc within the Midgar scenario. His new character theme of effective advocacy requires empathy is more applicable to modern times, specifically for those of us who are passionate and outspoken on contentious topics. When we engage in those debates, are we actually considering the feelings and perspectives of the people on the other side of the screen? Do we explain our views in a way that show compassion for their concerns? Or do we only consider the topic through our own perspective, uncaring of how our words and actions appear to those with a different worldview? Do we actually want our message to succeed? Or are we just shouting in an elevator? Both versions of Barret show an extreme degree of selfishness and narrow-minded thinking, but the theme conveyed by the original character arc is more broad and timeless, while the newer version focuses on a very specific theme that's more relevant to the current times. I personally lean towards the original character arc as more interesting and memorable, but I can see the value and appeal of both.